Hello and welcome to another episode of Indian Standard Time. My guest today is Ambassador Husain Haqqani, well-known Pakistani commentator, former journalist, a frequent visitor to New Delhi and a man who's familiar with India and India-Pakistan relations and of course US-Pakistan relations because you served there. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure being here, Siddharth.
I want to start, Husain Bhai, with US-Pakistan relations. We've seen considerable amount of ambivalence over the last decade on the part of successive governments in Washington when it comes to dealing with the Pakistani military as opposed to the Pakistani civilian leadership. On paper, the Americans pay lip service to the importance of democracy in Pakistan and the civilian leadership being in control. In reality, given the American preoccupation with Afghanistan and all their other commitments in the region, their other aims in the region, they find themselves dealing with the Pakistani military often over the heads of the civilian leadership. How has this equation changed in the last year or so? We've seen high-profile visits by the DGISI, by Chief of Army Staff Raheel Sharif to Washington. What can you tell us about the state of play as far as Washington's approach towards the civil-military question in Pakistan is concerned?
Well, the reply to that question is already in the question, the way you have framed it. The problem in Washington is that they would like Pakistan to have civilian governance and full civilian control of the military and the intelligence services. But they also realize that that full control does not exist. Now, people like me would argue that the way to facilitate that full control would be for Washington to try and deal more and more with the civilians and less directly with the military. But Washington's approach has been different. What they have done is, on the one hand, they keep saying that we want the civilians to assert control, but on the other, they say, till you have control, we will engage with the military. And of course, they also want what they call the mil-mil ties, meaning the relationship between the Pakistani military and the central command in Tampa. And as a result, what we are seeing is another attempt by Washington to try and get Pakistan to change its behavior as Washington would like it, especially in relation to terrorism, especially in relation to Afghanistan, by engaging the top military leadership. Americans often think that individuals make a huge difference. So it's like in a movie where some alien arrives and says, "Take me to your leader."
Exactly.
So the Americans always want the leader, and they know that that leader right now is not the prime minister. It is most likely the army chief.
Let me unpack your answer and question the premise of American policy, which is when they say that they would much rather that the civilians were in control. Could it actually be the opposite, that civilian control, given that America has such compelling military interests in the region, particularly in Afghanistan, they would fear the messiness of civilian control, the indecisiveness of civilian control? We see some of that even in India, where decisions perhaps aren't taken on time. Do you think then that the Americans actually are quite happy with the fact that the military, for the moment, is calling the shots, and as long as they are in Afghanistan?
I think the Americans do know that many of the problems they are having to deal with, including Afghanistan, the way Afghanistan has evolved since the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1989, is partly because of decisions made by the Pakistani military and Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, autonomously of the civilians. But at the same time, they don't want to have a vacuum in which they are dealing with a weak civilian government that is unable to exert control. So I don't think that they want completely to deal with the military, but they think they have to. And yes, I know that the Americans consider civilian rule a lot messy, but if that was like India, where even though the decisions are not taken, the fact remains that the civilians are in control. And any inability to make decisions is because it wasn't done, not because they can't do it. In case of Pakistan, where there have been 4 military coups, where the military actually does dictate to the civilians, I think we can't blame the Americans for wanting the military. Actually, they just think they are having to deal with the military.
But in a way, every extra bit that they engage with the Pakistani military leadership undermines civilian authority in a way.
The thing that they don't accept, which people like me have argued, I've argued it in my book, I've argued it in my personal conduct, I've always argued that the reason why the Pakistani military has become as powerful as it has in Pakistan is because America has been Pakistan's main patron for many, many decades since inception, and then China has also become a secondary patron, and all of Pakistan's patrons end up patronizing the military. So when the resources flow through the military, then the military's advantage gets enhanced rather than diminished.
And you found as ambassador that this approach of, in a way, privileging the Pakistani military cuts across party lines, cuts across bureaucratic divisions, State Department, Pentagon.
Yes, it does.
They're all on the same page on this?
Yes, it does. All of them are on the same page. I mean, of course, the Pentagon likes the military a lot more because they've dealt with them. Although that has changed. In Afghanistan, the American military officers serving in Afghanistan, they have returned with a lot more hostility towards Pakistan. And as ambassador, I warned our military that that is what they should be looking at. Down the road, when the colonels who served in Afghanistan as colonels become generals, they will not be as favorably disposed towards Pakistan as the previous generation of American military officers were, who had a positive view of Pakistan as a Cold War ally. That said, I think that overall the American sort of desire for some kind of action always brings them to the military because they think they get more action out of the military than they do out of the civilians. And the full control of the civilians has not yet been established, unlike in India or other countries. So they are willing to deal with the messiness of democracy when they know that at least that democracy functions. In Pakistan's case, they are not certain that that democracy functions. And they also know that sometimes the civilians themselves shrug their shoulders and say, ask our military. In that, I would blame Pakistan's civilian leaders who haven't asserted themselves adequately and who have sometimes allowed themselves to become embroiled in infighting, in institutional conflicts, such as the conflict between the executive branch and the judiciary, and where the leaders' own credibility erodes immediately after election, leading them to become subsidiary to the military rather than being assertive in relation to it.
If I were to invert my question and ask, try to understand how the Pakistani military evaluates the US. We've seen in survey after survey, Pew Global Foundation and so on, Pakistan the disapproval rating of the United States and Pakistan is perhaps the highest anywhere in the world. Something like 80% of the population has a negative view of Pakistan. Is this opinion shared by the Pakistani military? Can they be immune?
So.
Can they be immune from this?
Oh, no. I think that, in fact, very much the Pakistani civilian opinion has turned against the United States, partly because the Pakistani military's view of the United States has consistently gone down since 1965. Pakistan had unusual expectations of America. Pakistan went into the relationship with the United States thinking that the United States will lend Pakistan its shoulders so that Pakistan could see eye to eye with India. The American plan was very different. They wanted to use Pakistan in the Cold War, but they also wanted to have autonomous relations with India. When that Pakistan military's desires didn't work out, Pakistan turned against the United States or had a negative view of it. That said, Pakistan has some built-in constraints. The Pakistani military consumes a lot of resources. Pakistan is not a manufacturer of many of the types of stuff that they need for military purposes. And they don't have the revenue base. Right. Pakistan has also had a consistent problem with its foreign exchange reserve position. So there they need assistance. And the one country that has been generous and willing to give that assistance is the United States. So it's like being in a relationship where you have a patron whom you dislike, but despite that dislike, till you can find an adequately strong alternative, you continue to consider them a patron.
So we're looking at a very fine balance here. You have Pakistan, which is suspicious of the US, but is dependent on America for military aid and military supplies. You have the Americans who are suspicious of the Pakistani military, but are dependent on them, so they believe, for their war in Afghanistan. What would it take for this balance to get disrupted and for something fundamental to alter in the way either side looks at the other?
I think that the American withdrawal from Afghanistan will significantly alter this balance. I think the Americans will, and the American military will need Pakistan less. When they need Pakistan less, they will be less dependent for logistics, for example. When the Americans stop depending on Pakistan and therefore offering it less and less largesse, the Pakistani military will have to cast around for policy alternatives. So far, the Pakistani military has pursued what I call a fixed paradigm. The paradigm I stated in my first book, Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, that Islam is the national unifier, India is the existential enemy or threat, and at the same time, Uncle Sam is the provider of last resort for a country that cannot raise enough revenue. That paradigm will start shifting if the Americans stop giving as much to Pakistan as they have in the past. They've given $40 billion in assistance since 1950, which is far more than they've given Taiwan or South Korea, for example.
If your analysis is correct, then that would mean the Pakistani military would ideally prefer the Americans to carry on indefinitely in Afghanistan. Is that?
I would say that the Pakistan military would want the Americans engaged in the region, for a very, very long time.
And to maintain military presence.
And they wouldn't mind the military presence because, after all, that military presence confers strength on Pakistan. Remember, throughout the period that there were large numbers of American troops in Afghanistan, the United States needed what they called the ground lines of communication, equipment coming at Karachi port, which was the cheapest way of transporting that equipment from Karachi by road into Afghanistan. That gave Pakistan revenue, that gave Pakistan influence, that gave Pakistan access to the highest echelons of NATO decision making.
I want to turn to Pakistan-China relations. You've given a lecture on this, something that you've been looking at for some time. To what extent could China be a substitute, a replacement for the United States? We know that until now, Pakistan has been quite adept at playing both of these countries, or being on the good, having good relations with both of these countries. As contradictions accentuate between Beijing and Washington, that game might be harder and harder to play. How does that dynamic play out, in your view?
Well, first of all, I think a lot depends on what does China want in relation to the entire region. Prime Minister Modi is scheduled to go to China. China's president has already been to India, but hasn't been to Pakistan since the election of the current government. China has for a long time told Pakistan that Pakistan should adopt an approach towards Kashmir that is similar to China's approach towards Taiwan, which means don't give up your claim, but at the same time don't press it and move on other things. China wants Pakistan to actually build a stronger economy like itself. So there again, will China take into account only strategic factors, or will it also look at the whole economic picture, in which case India may be a bigger economic partner for China than Pakistan? All of those factors would influence the Pakistan-China relationship. So far...
So just to stop you for a second. So just like the United States at the end of the Cold War, for a variety of reasons, zeroes in on South Asia and says, hang on a minute, India is by far the more attractive partner here. Could the Chinese also end up doing something similar?
I'm one of those who fears that.
Okay.
I think that Pakistan, by playing a zero-sum game in relation to India and by telling people you are either with India or with us, ends up telling people indirectly that they should make a choice, go for India, because that's the bigger prize. The best course for Pakistan would be to make its own peace with India and have a better relationship, and then not present people with this choice. But in case of China, China has consistently used Pakistan as a secondary deterrent against India. It started in the 1960s. It's a good way to keep India tied down in South Asia.
There was the nuclear missile proliferation.
All of it was tried to keep, so that India cannot think of itself as China's competitor, but is constantly boiled down in a two-front situation. They're competing with Pakistan, they're competing with China. But China is changing. And China's whole economic outlook has been very different. Now, if China is to see itself as a global leader, which it sees itself as emerging within a few years, it will be the world's largest economy. It's already headed in that direction. Will it also have a major strategic role around the world? In that situation, they have to start thinking beyond the way they thought in the 1960s. And that may be the moment where Pakistan might actually end up holding its ambitions and its expectations in its hands without them being fulfilled. Because Pakistan has very unusually high expectations of China, just as they did of the Americans in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think Pakistan needs to become more realistic. Look, when the Chinese recently issued a map for the maritime Silk Route, Pakistan was not included in it. It was bypassed. Even in the land Silk Road, Pakistan's northern area is passed through, but the rest of the country is not part of it. Pakistanis think the port of Gwadar is very important to China. The Chinese don't seem to say that. So is Pakistan actually overestimating their relationship with China? I'm one of those who's worried that maybe we are.
We saw something similar, I suppose, at the end of the Kargil War. Well, in a way, it hastened the end of the Kargil War when the Pakistanis went to the Chinese and to the Americans and were told
By both, the same thing.
That back off.
And I think on Afghanistan, the Americans and the Chinese are not very far apart. I don't think either one wants the return of the Taliban. I don't think either one thinks that the Haqqani network is a very positive influence. And even about jihadi groups, China has been subtly and gently giving the message that it does not like Pakistan having a jihadi safe haven, even if that jihadi safe haven is directed purely against India. China doesn't like it. Second thing that one must take into account is that China does not behave like America in terms of giving aid. They want to trade, they want to invest, and their investment and trade decisions are based purely on economic considerations. So Pakistan will have to get its economic act together to be able to get Chinese assistance. And lastly, there are many things that Pakistanis totally ignore. For example, the fact that the Chinese president could not come to Pakistan because of street protests by cricketer Imran Khan and cleric Tahir al-Qadri, and that since then he hasn't been able to find time to go to Pakistan. And then
there's no discussion of new dates or anything, right?
Well, there is some, but it's not coming through. Right. Secondly, if you remember, when President Obama came for the Republic Day parade in India, Pakistan announced its own Republic Day parade after many years and said
the Chinese will be coming.
The Chinese president will be coming, but the Chinese president is not coming. So why is that happening? That's China's way of communicating to Pakistan. Don't try to play us against the Americans. We have our own relationship with the Americans. We want to have our own relationship with the Indians. We are your friends.
Right.
But being friends is very different from being your supporters in conflicts that you are yourself prolonging.
Right. I want to turn to Afghanistan now. It seems as if one bright spot for Pakistan or Pakistani diplomacy has been the improvement in relations with Kabul ever since Ashraf Ghani became president. We saw, to my mind, the unprecedented visit to GHQ of the Afghan president shortly after he came to power. Very unusual visit, but I suppose they're taking a page out of the American playbook here. Are things now on an even keel, and is there cooperation between the two sides, or is there still residual suspicion?
Look, I am one of those who thinks that individuals do make a difference, but only up to a point. They also have a situation to deal with. President Ashraf Ghani was elected, and he thought that he had a way to deal with Pakistan in relation to Afghanistan. He thought that China and Saudi Arabia excuse me, could prevail upon Pakistan. And then Pakistan could prevail upon the Taliban. And then there could be talks with the Taliban that would actually provide for a relatively gentle and softer landing for Afghanistan in relation to the insurgency problem. My fear there is that Pakistan may not be able to fulfill President Ashraf Ghani's expectations, that they are unrealistic expectations. That said, it is in Pakistan's interest to have good relations with Afghanistan, and it's in Afghanistan's interest to have good relations with Pakistan. The real problem has been Pakistan's attitude in the past that they want to install a government of their choice in Afghanistan. In that sense, Ashraf Ghani has really held out some promise by saying to the Pakistanis, I can be your friend here. You don't have to bring Mullah Umar to be your friend, or Jalaluddin Haqqani or Siraj Haqqani. I am here. And that's a positive thing. However, at the end of the day, Afghanistan needs assistance and support from everybody in the region, broader region. For Pakistan to expect that Ashraf Ghani will create a situation in which Pakistan will have a big hand in Afghanistan, but Russia, Iran, and India will have no role whatsoever, may be again something that Ashraf Ghani may not be able to fulfill, at least in the medium and long term. But in the short term, the relationship is good. If Pakistan can modify its position, I think Pakistan-Afghan relations can be better. And at some point, Pakistan has to improve relations with India as well, so that the India-Pakistan-Afghanistan equation becomes stable rather than becoming the source of friction and proxy wars.
We saw the visit in India. We saw the visit of the Foreign Secretary S. Jaishankar to Islamabad as a clever way for Prime Minister Modi to, in a way, back out of the dead end to which the relationship went when we cancelled Foreign Secretary talks last August. There was the excuse of what to do about SARC that was cited, but clearly they spoke about bilateral relations. And I think it was a positive meeting. That's what I hear. I was in Islamabad soon after that meeting. What struck me, though, on the negative side, however, were statements by the Pakistani Defense Minister, by the Pakistani Foreign Secretary too, accusing India of trying to weaken Pakistan's fight against the TTP. what's going on there? Why would an allegation which really strains the credibility of anybody? I mean, I can understand line of control firing, Pakistan accusing India of disproportionate response. But is there a serious belief in the Pakistani establishment that India does not want them to succeed in their fight against the TTP?
I really don't know whether they really believe it or not, but they do say it.
Right.
And I agree
So what's
with you.
behind that? What's behind this articulation of this?
It may be just one of those gut instinct things. They've believed it for so many years. They have almost never looked at themselves. When East Pakistan was slipping out of our hands, they failed to see the problems that had been created from Punjabi domination over Bengalis. That was the cause of the problem. Of course, India played a hand in East Pakistan. Of course, India played a role in Bangladesh war, but that wasn't the real reason. It was a secondary role. So maybe they believe it. Maybe they believe that everything that goes wrong in Pakistan has an Indian dimension. It's not something the rest of the world believes. And the more they are willing to align their understanding of circumstances with the understanding of the rest of the world, the greater credibility they'll have. They can say these things, but nobody believes them. Right. As far as Foreign Secretary Jaishankar's visit is concerned, I think that it was a very good move by Prime Minister Modi to give the message that we are not the ones who don't want to talk. We want to engage. And he very frankly went to Islamabad and in some ways put the ball in Pakistan's court. But no follow-up was agreed upon. Right. No composite dialogue resumption, no dates for Pakistan's Foreign Secretary to come to New Delhi. Right. Basically meaning, we've done our bit, we are not the people responsible for the breakdown of talks. I think at some point, both Pakistan and India have to see the elephant in the room. From Pakistan's point of view, the elephant in the room is Kashmir. But there is no immediate solution for Kashmir in sight. We have to be realistic about it as Pakistanis. And we have to look for new solutions. From India's point of view, the elephant in the room is terrorism. And as a Pakistani, I think it would be in Pakistan's interest to really move fast to shut down jihadism, not just the TTP. Right. I mean, the TTP is one group fighting the TTP, but doing nothing about the LET and the LEJ and other groups, right. JUM, and the whole alphabet soup of jihadi groups. Is not good for Pakistan. The jihadis have become a nuisance for Pakistan. We saw recently the attacks on the churches in Lahore had nothing to do with India. Right. It had nothing to do with Afghanistan. It had to do with the internal dynamic of Pakistan. So Pakistan needs to confront all these groups. Stop looking at it as an external problem. Right. Start looking at it as an internal problem.
Provocations like the decision to try to release Zakiur Rahman Lakhvi, who was the prime accused of the Bombay attack. Where is this coming from? Are there divisions within the establishment, or is this just the accident-prone nature of the relationship? What's happening?
It's part of all of those factors. It's partly the accident-prone nature, but it's also partly divisions within the establishment. And more important than that, it's the national discourse in Pakistan. I mean, there are judges who really believe that evidence that is presented by India should not be admissible because India is the enemy. Right. Not looking at the law, but just this sentiment. I think we've built this sentiment over the last several decades, and now we are having trouble erasing that. Every Pakistani child ends up learning about India as an enemy. That is really a poisonous thought. Right. I mean, I know that similar thought some people say could exist on this side, but there are many Indians who really think all they need to do is have good relations with Pakistan, accept Pakistan. A lot of Indians disagree with the idea of partition, but nobody now says it should be undone. Right. Pakistanis need to move forward as well and recognize that India is always going to be our neighbor. We need to have normal relations. As far as the Lakhvi case is concerned, the good news is that the government decided to continue with his detention. The bad news is that the thing that he should be tried for and punished for, which is the Mumbai attacks, is just not happening. Right. The trial is moving too slowly, the evidence is not being recognized, and somehow there is an unwillingness on the part of my countrymen to accept that if a Pakistani orchestrates an attack inside India, that attack is wrong, and Pakistan should stand with India in punishing the guy responsible for doing it.
We're nearly out of time, but I wanted to end with one last question. We started this program looking at US relations with the Pakistani military, and there was an op-ed written recently in India by Ambassador Vivek Karju, who advocated that perhaps it's time for the Indian government to talk to the Pakistani military. He said when Jaishankar went, he should have asked for an appointment also with Rahil Sharif. How wise do you think such an approach would be?
Well, for one thing, it would be unconstitutional in the Pakistani constitutional sense. Foreign secretaries should not and do not meet army chiefs, unless, of course, they do that with the with the blessings of the civilian authorities.
But don't their counterparts from Britain or the US meet army people all the time?
The Americans and the British do. And I think they do it, of course, nominally through the Foreign Office.
Right.
They request them.
Right.
Should you also do that? It's entirely your decision. Right. I have nothing to say. I don't think you will get anything out of it. Because at the end of the day, an army is raised to fight, not to negotiate.
Right.
And the very fact that we have an army that has become overwhelming in our political system. Look, I support the Pakistani army if it were fighting to defend my country. I do not like the army taking over functions for which it is not trained and for which it has no constitutional basis. So I think that I'm familiar with this argument of Ambassador Karju and many others in Delhi who think if only we could talk to them, the army, and then the army will... Well, you talked to the army when Musharraf was in charge. He was army chief, he was president, both at the same time. What did you get out of it? You can't get anything out of negotiating with different individuals. It's about negotiating with the country as a whole. Pakistan has to negotiate with itself as well. The civilians and the military have to... Look, the civilians have consistently talked about better relations with India.
Right.
They've consistently talked about seeking new solutions to all problems, including Kashmir.
Right.
It's the army that has a fixed paradigm. What needs to be done in Pakistan is that instead of the army calling the shots, the army should submit itself to constitutional supremacy of civilian leaders and let them do the negotiation.
Right. Ambassador Husain Haqqani, it's been a real pleasure having you on Rajya Sabha TV. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure talking to you as always.
Do join us again next week for another guest on Indian Standard Time. Thank you.